that round of applause going for the CEO of BDSA, Micah Tapman. Micah, come on out. Keep it going, guys.
All right. Now we're in for the excitement. Nothing but data for the next 20 minutes. Really, really exciting. I'll actually try to make it as exciting as I possibly can, but the easiest way to make it more exciting is actually for people to come to the front, because you will not be able to see the detail on the slide up on the presentation if you're in the far back. So if you're interested in some of the numbers, I will be talking about a lot of them, but there's a lot more on the slides. And so we need to move people up to the front where possible. All right, we're going to be doing a cannabis market review looking at the Northeast. Now, first of all, just a little context. BDSA started back in 2015, and it started because as investors, we did not know how to make solid investments. We were essentially shooting in the dark, and it was very frustrating. So what we did was we helped to set up BDSA back in 2015, and the idea was to bring transparency to the industry and to inform the decision-making process. That's really key for the BDSA mission, is informing the decision-making process, removing uncertainty. You can think of us essentially as the equivalent of the weather service. We're helping you to understand if it is likely to rain tomorrow, what the temperature is outside, not just is it hot or cold, but what is the actual temperature. We do that with a couple of different product areas: retail sales tracking, market forecasts, and consumer insights. Working backwards on that, the consumer is where all of the wealth in this industry starts. Right? This is about shoppers. What are they purchasing and where's that money coming from? The market forecast is the macroeconomic view about where is this industry going overall? What does the next 18, 36, 60 months look like? And we'll get into that in detail. And of course, retail sales tracking, this is what's moving through the point of sale systems at the actual stores. So this is the hard data that we see moving through the system. Now, this is the macroeconomic global view. You can see here, we're looking at about $30 billion globally in the legal cannabis market right now, jumping up to $62 billion in 5 years. Talking about increase about 15% a year. That is a little bit faster at the beginning, and that increase rate does slow a little bit as you get to 2024, 2025, 2026, which of course makes sense to most of us involved in the industry. Now for a little comparison here, I want to think about some other industries that are analogs to the cannabis industry to some degree. Beer, wine, tobacco, all could be considered an analog to the cannabis industry. By the way, I'm careful to say could be because they are not perfect analogs at all for the cannabis industry. But beer is sitting at $552 billion globally, but the growth rate is only about 5% on that beer industry, right? So the growth rate of cannabis is tremendous compared to some of these other industries. The size of cannabis is still pretty small. It is growing rapidly, and at $62 billion, it is too big to ignore, which is the real takeaway from this. The large companies in the world will be paying attention to this industry over time. Right now, it is still a very small piece of the overall global economy. Now, what is driving that actual $62 billion, and where does this come from? In one simple statement, it is the US recreational market. Right? That is the 800-pound gorilla of the legal cannabis development over the next 5 years. We can see here the medical market in the US is a significant contributor, as is Canada, with both legal medical and legal adult use. The rest of the world is very, very small comparatively. But US adult use / recreational will be the main driver of growth for the cannabis industry over the next several years. Now, the takeaway I like to look at for this slide, which is a little bit interesting, is the difference between the medical versus adult use in the US. A way to think about this is if you're a large player, you cannot ignore the recreational market in the US. It is the only place that you're going to be able to actually be a large player. Because if you're stuck in one of the other segments, if you're medical only, you are by definition limited with your addressable market, and there is no way for you to outgrow that particular market, because that is your limiting factor. This is the way, if you look at, for example, a beer company. A beer company can get into craft beer, and they can make good money in craft beer. They cannot become a Budweiser and Anheuser-Busch in craft beer. They must move into the mass market beer category in order to actually hit those scales. And that's what we're seeing as we look 5 years out. Now, top markets, California, no-brainer. Colorado, interesting one. That's largely about the fact that they started pretty early, and we consume a lot of cannabis in Colorado. It's where I live, so I'll speak firsthand for that one. Florida is up there as well, high population state, and they've gotten a good head start with their medical program. New York, of course, on there, another huge state, a bit of a late starter in a way, but we expect them to catch up pretty quickly. And Michigan, which is an interesting market, good population, and they have a ton of points of distribution already, 400 plus dispensaries active and operating. So they actually have a bit of a head start as well. This is how the states add on to the total, right? So if you look at this, I really like this particular graphic because you see the volume of states joining the legal movement and the increase of the total percentage of population that have access to legal cannabis. We're rapidly approaching about 44% of the population having access to legal cannabis. Very, very interesting to look at that. And I should actually caveat that to say legal adult use cannabis, right? Legal adult use cannabis as we go. Now, one of the things about this is you start to think about this and you assume that this is dominoes. So if New York legalizes adult use, what is Pennsylvania going to do? And there's some people who believe that Pennsylvania will be forced to move relatively quickly, or they'll lose business to New York. There are other people who say, no, they're going to be holdouts. They're going to be states that actually move a little bit slower. For example, BDSA's official position is we expect recreational sales in Pennsylvania to start in 2024, about 2 years out. So a little bit longer than some people would expect, given that New York is legalizing right away. At the same time, the startup of these states ranges from Arizona pace, which was about 90 days. They legalized recreational use in the November election, and they had actual recreational sales 90 days later in that state. You compare that to Massachusetts, which legalized, and I think it was about 2.5 years from the time there was legalization until actual recreational sales in Massachusetts. So that is a huge factor as we look at the contribution to the total, trying to understand the timing. And we're going to get into that actually in the panel coming up next, looking at when to make an investment, because of course the time value of money plays against you in a lot of cases in the cannabis industry. Contributors. We're looking at the states here: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all in the top 10 states contributing to the growth for 2026. Right? Again, these states in many cases are catching up, but they're using their high population to catch up with the total, right? And coming essentially on par with Colorado and Oregon and some of those smaller states that moved a little bit faster in the West. This is an interesting one because when we look at this, you can see that Florida, for example, is the best performing medical state right now. Ohio is another one that's on this list. Again, high population. The belief is that they can catch up and really contribute to the growth overall. One of the catches, though, is this is not just about new states. Look at that California number, plus 25%. Right? That's 2021 growth. So that is the largest single cannabis market in the world that grows 25% this year. That is a massive, massive market. And in many ways, it's too large to ignore, and the growth rate is too high to ignore. Now, it does get dwarfed when you look at Massachusetts with 127% growth. Right? So when you're looking at growth rate, it can be a little bit deceptive because of the base sizes that we're dealing with. The base size of Massachusetts being much, much smaller than the base size of California. Some of the more interesting ones, by the way, Illinois killed it this year, 101% growth. That was pretty kick-ass for Illinois, and very impressive to see that. They really got some things sorted out with that program, and it really started to take off. Colorado, my state, Interesting one here. Everybody sort of tends to think about that as like, it's a mature state, it's hyper competitive, it's hard to grow, whatever. 16% growth. By the way, that's approaching $3 billion in Colorado alone, right? So it's rapidly growing still, and it is still one of the largest cannabis ecosystems in the world. And we break this out just looking at essentially average spend and sort of where this goes. We're seeing a few $100s average spend when you look at just citizens in the state versus the total spending in that state. And this is the roughest of calculations, just to give you some ideas. And by the way, one note to this is that we do not include in this calculation tourism. So for example, Colorado, again, my state, so I know it well, we have about 40 to 45 million visitors in any given year. We only have 5 million citizens. So the spend per citizen looks really, really high for Colorado, but it's because we get a lot of tourists. Apparently, when you come to town, you swing by the dispensary and pick up some product on your way up to Vail or Beaver Creek. I want to highlight here, we've got 4 states right around here, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, in the $2 to $3 billion range by 2026. These are going to be massive markets, make no bones about it. Deep dive into Pennsylvania, and this is for the real nerds in the room to actually dive in on Pennsylvania data. So we're looking at a population just shy of 10 million. We're looking at sales that are approaching $1 billion, about 100 different brands that are operating in the state, and about 132 retailers. So when you start looking at these macroeconomics for Pennsylvania itself, you can start to dive in. To give you just a rough analysis, by the way, there are probably, I think we're tracking over 600 brands in California. So when you look at Pennsylvania versus a California, the brand concentration is completely different. And frankly, the competitive environment is completely different. That is medical only in Pennsylvania, adult use, and medical in California. So when we look at this, we look at registered patients, obviously, because the patient count is very important for the addressable market size. We see that going up about 20%, which is a nice positive increase, obviously. The patient spend, we can see per trip, they're spending about $80. Per month, about 100. So you can do that math and say, making about 1.2 trips per month to the store. And you can see my favorite chart's the one in the bottom left there, which is that slow, steady trend up and to the right. It's every finance person's idea of a good chart, trending up and to the right. And that's really nice to see. One highlight I want to make to this is that this is very typical. You do not typically see major jumps because it takes a long time to open new stores, bring new product to market, have new brands enter the market, etc. So anytime you see the hockey stick chart for cannabis growth, be very suspicious. As I actually heard Kim mention today about on the TrueLeave discussion this morning, everything takes longer in the cannabis world than it does elsewhere, and opening new stores and stuff like that is one of them. Purchasing influencers. This is a really interesting point as we dive deeper into the BDSA data set, because really the point of BDSA at the end of the day is, again, to remove uncertainty from the decision-making process. So if you're a business owner and you're trying to make a decision, we want to provide you with data that helps you to make that decision and removes uncertainty from that process. So you can see here top 3 influencers for a purchase: high THC, taste or flavor, and natural ingredients. So you might, for example, as a brand, want to go in one of those directions, or maybe 2 or 3 of those directions, to drive that purchase at the retailer. The reasons for consuming: pain, relaxing, and managing anxiety, which, by the way, I might put as 2 sides of the same coin for that one. But again, coming back to this, these are actually the number of people, or the percentage of people, who indicate that is their primary reason for purchasing cannabis in Pennsylvania. So 14% of people say relieving pain is their number 1 reason for purchasing. Now, anybody realize what that means to Tylenol, Advil, aspirin, and that entire category? So you look at that and you immediately need to pivot to over-the-counter pain relief and medication. the Icy Hots of the world, the Advils of the world, etc. Right? Huge disruptor, and that is the reason I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that beer and wine and tobacco are not perfect analogs for cannabis. They do not necessarily compete with pain management. Right? So make sure, as you're looking at this, that you understand these reasons for purchasing. Looking at the brands and the MSOs playing in these various states, Mass, PA, New York, New Jersey, we see some very familiar names up on this list. Rhythm/GTI, Cresco Labs and the Cresco brand, Curaleaf coming out of the West and really doing well in these states. So these are some of the big players. Now we're going to be talking on the panel a little bit about whether or not we believe, as industry experts, I use that term loosely, I'm not sure anybody's really an expert in this industry because it changes so much. But at the end of the day, do we believe the big players can translate from market to market? And this is an open question, right? We don't necessarily see a national dominant brand or company, but there are emerging some really big companies. When we look at the Trulievs, the GTIs, the Crescos, the Curaleafs, they are big enough to actually be called big companies at this point in time. One of the big challenges that we are watching within the BDSA realm is the translation of brands across markets. So from one state or province to another. And that has been an interesting dynamic to watch. Frankly, that is a very chaotic and emerging area of research to understand if a brand can successfully translate between markets. Price comparisons. Jumping into this, you can see Massachusetts is more than double the price for concentrates than Colorado. This makes perfect sense to people who are dealing in those industries. They run into shortages of inputs. They run into shortages of manufacturing. They run into distribution problems, et cetera, all driving up the price. Anybody trying to buy flour in Illinois when they first launched, it was basically if you didn't pre-order and have it ready to go, you probably weren't getting flour because there were not enough cultivators to supply the market. The flip side of that is when the market supply catches up, the prices tend to crash, as we've seen out west with places like Oregon and California, even Colorado, seeing a lot of price drops. So you need to really be thinking about that and watching that translation. I'll sort of skip over this one. You can get the deck, feel free to reach out, which sort of breaks out the differences. What I do want to highlight, and I heard it on the panel right before me, if there is not interstate commerce allowed, which by the way, we don't believe there will be interstate commerce allowed for quite some time, several years, these state borders become really, really interesting to watch because of the tax differences between states or the regulatory differences between states. As a call out, if New Jersey limits flour purchases to 1 ounce and New York allows 3 ounces of flour to be purchased, is somebody going to go over to New York to purchase a higher amount and potentially get a good discount on that rather than just sticking to New Jersey where they can get a smaller amount? I want to dive in just a little bit on this idea of why people are actually purchasing. And this is the consumer insights piece of what BDSA does. So you can see here the rankings for the #1 reason that people are purchasing. We talked before about relieving pain, improving overall health, getting higher stoned. That's my dad's favorite use for cannabis, which debunks the baby boomer trend. But interesting point here. The reason that people consume and the way they consume are tied together. Makes good sense when you think about it because, of course, if you want to relax at a party, there's a good chance you hit up a vape because in just a few seconds, you're going to get that feeling of being a little bit high. If you're relieving pain, then putting on a topical, a cream, makes a lot of sense because you're familiar with that. If you want to go to sleep, doing some sort of pill or edible makes a lot of sense in that realm as well. But this, again, raises the question for a brand, making sure they cover all of the form factors and the categories, if they want to appeal for the different use cases. Last point I want to make here is the consumer base is growing very, very rapidly, even in states that have been legal for a long time, right? When we look at Colorado, we're jumping from 42% to 48% consumer base. That is a large increase for a state that has been legal for 7 years at this point, right? And we expect that trend to continue. With that, I am out of time. There's my contact info, or BDSA's contact info up there, info@bdsa.com. My contact info is just Micah@bdsa.com, so feel free to reach out directly, or you can go through Benzinga, I think, as well. Is it?
True, yes.
Events, was it?
Events@benzinga.com.
Events@benzinga.com. And with that, I think I'm out of time, so we got to jump right into the panel.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
All right, give it up for Micah, BDSA. Thank you, Micah.